Guys, I want to read you something that I wrote today. What kind of world do we live in where a child who was taken away from her neglectful, drug-addicted birth mom and her absent father is murdered by her foster parent, who was being paid to protect her from further neglect? What kind of world do we live in? We live in a world where little Layla Marie Daniel was failed to death. This was little Layla's world, where her foster parents, Jennifer and Joseph Rosenbaum, appeared to have a nice house and budding careers, so nobody questioned their ability to properly care for little Layla and her big sister Millie. This was little Layla and Millie's world, where the Rosenbaums were not properly vetted or trained before the girls were placed in their home. This was Layla and Millie's world, where the girls lived in fear for 4 months straight behind the front door with a big R on it. This was Layla and Millie's world, where the Rosenbaums were allowed to abuse and neglect them, and the adults who the girls should have been able to trust to protect them either chose to look the other way or were too busy to care that Layla and Millie were in danger. This was little Layla and Millie's world, where after eating prison food for dinner and going upstairs to her bedroom, the abuser told Millie to come back downstairs. This was Layla and Millie's world, where Jennifer Rosenbaum had just killed Millie's little sister Layla. This was little Layla and Millie's world, where their abusers told Millie to get in the car, and they drove her to the hospital, where she learned that her baby sister was dead. What kind of world do we live in, where over 3 years later, a 7-year-old child is forced to testify in court against her abuser, the abuser who had killed her baby sister? What kind of world do we live in, where the 7-year-old Millie was forced to face her abusers during her testimony, right in the courtroom, instead of being allowed to testify from a separate room? What kind of world do we live in, where the abusers were allowed to sit right in Millie's direct sight while she testified, with no screen in place to protect her from having to see one of them attempting to establish eye contact with her, and the other one repeatedly shaking her head no, then staring her down? What kind of world do we live in, where the prosecutor asks 7-year-old Millie to stand up and identify the 2 people who had abused and neglected her and her baby sister, and who caused her baby sister's death? What kind of world do we live in, where family members line up, and even the stuck-up bridesmaid too, to testify at the trial of a killer and her husband who did nothing at all to stop her, while feigning offense that the prosecutor had dared to accuse their loved ones of committing such heinous crimes? What kind of world do we live in? Well, thankfully, we live in a world where precious children are valued by the people who fight to protect them, and who will fight for justice when children are harmed. Thankfully, we live in a world where little Millie received the counseling services she needed to deal effectively with the death of her sister and for the abuses that both she and her sister suffered leading up to little Layla's death. Thankfully, we live in a world where loving parents adopt children in need of a safe home. Thankfully, we live in a world where the counselors were able to help Millie feel safe enough to testify at the trial of the people responsible for her sister's death and for the abuses that she and her sister both suffered leading up to little Layla's death. Thankfully, we live in a world where the prosecutors work their asses off to bring justice for little Layla, and for her big sister Millie, too. And thankfully, we live in a world where 7-year-old children are encouraged to speak right into the microphone in open court, and who are then asked to stand right up and point at the two monsters who harmed her and her baby sister. What kind of world do we live in? Thankfully, we live in a world that sent Jennifer and Joseph Rosenbaum to prison for 30 to 40 years, where they will never again be allowed to abuse, torture, or kill innocent children.